Oh, hello. Welcome to the 2013 Hundie Challenge. Today we're going to be discussing All Flesh Must Be Eaten by Sammy Davis Jr. Dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-doo-dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-doo, dee-doo-dee-doo-doo-dee-doo-doo. So if you've watched any of these videos, you know that you're probably bored with me saying this, but I almost always preface my videos by saying that I don't read the introductions, I don't read the prefaces, the intros, outros, all that good stuff that usually comes in a book, because I'm just trying to get through them this year. Now, in the case of some of the audiobooks, like, for instance, The Way of All Flesh, they'll have a preface that's part of a track that I sort of have to either listen to or, like, it's more trouble to not listen to it than to just let it go. So that was the case with The Way of All Flesh. And I'm actually kind of glad that I did listen to the preface this time, because apparently this was written in the 1860s. And Butler considered it too controversial. Well, it didn't really go into why he didn't release it, but he wouldn't release it until his death. It is, of course, very tame by modern standards, but it didn't get published until the 20th century. So this is interesting. This book is a holdover from the 19th century that just wasn't technically published until the 20th century, but made it onto this list anyhow. I will say it was a pretty good book. A little old-fashioned. I take that into account. I'd probably still give it like 3 or 4 stars. It was definitely kept my interest, definitely kept me listening, and bearing in mind that it was actually set in the 1860s rather than the turn of the century or whatever. It was an interesting look at that time period in England, which, at least in America, we're usually concentrating on the Civil War, which was going on then. And he mentioned that briefly, something about cotton prices or something like that. But it was mostly about some of the religious upheaval that was going on in that first part of the 19th century, due to Darwin, and there were some like schisms in the Church of England. I think that a number of the characters were clergymen, and they were dealing with all of these schisms that were going on. And I realized not too far into it that this was kind of a religious satire, which we haven't really seen this year. I haven't, anyway. Death Comes for the Archbishop was religious, but it was pretty straightforward. There might have been 1 or 2 that, maybe took shots at religion or something like that, but for the most part, I don't think there was a full-blown religious satire. This book, basically the long and short of it is, the main character, his dad is really shitty to him. He's a clergyman, and he's shitty to his son. Even though his father before him, the grandfather, was shitty to him too. The father said something like, one of the funniest parts in the book, it was like laugh out loud funny, was when the father sends a letter to the grandfather and says, I'm ready to graduate from the seminary, but I'm not sure I have a calling to the Church of England. Maybe they call it the priesthood, maybe they don't. And he said, I don't think I have a calling. Do you think I should go through with it? And the grandfather, writes back this scathing, sarcastic letter, and he's like, of course no one would make you go through with it. But then he goes on and on and on for pages about how much money it cost him to put through the seminary, and what a disappointment he is, and what a little shit he is if he doesn't go through with it. And the father reading it goes, oh, I don't have to go through with it. That was one of the, I know, it's just a little thing, but it was one of the funniest parts of the book. But anyway, the grandfather visited that shittiness on the father visited that shittiness again on the son. Now, the son had this aunt, Alethea. Of course, her name springs to mind. I can't think of any of the other characters' names, if you couldn't tell. What was his name? All right. Anyway, Aunt Alethea set aside a sum of money for the son for when he grew up and reached the age of majority at 28. Well, that wasn't the age of majority, but she said 28. So this guy goes through his life. He loses all of his money. He's down and out. He was middle class, but he went to jail because he, having gone to the seminary, he didn't understand women, and so he tried to rape a woman. He went to jail for it, lost all his money in bad investments, and just is down on his luck. Turns away from the church. But then all is kind of right in the end. Oh, but then his father comes and his father really wants to be like, see, I told you so, I told you so. But when it comes down to it, the son finally gets this huge inheritance from his aunt. It's like £70,000 or something. It was like game-changing time. So he finally gets his inheritance, and he's kind of like, so it was actually a pretty good book. I'm not describing it real well, but it was, kind of old-fashioned, but kind of interesting, and kind of an interesting take on some of those religious issues from that time period that we don't normally look at. So thanks for tuning in, and we will see you next time.